take care of it that way. Tonight we're going to deal with another voice of the 20th century, and that's the voice of the urban black ghetto, in a book written by John Weidman called The Hiding Place. Now, when you ever read the works of John Weidman, and one of the things we've been trying to do the last few weeks is to review historical details. But when you view the works of John Weidman, history is a family's perception of itself over 100 years. If you notice, when you looked at the family tree at the front of your book, you have a perception of what Weidman's family was like. The family began in the 1840s when Sabella Owens, a slave, married Charlie Bell, the son of a slave owner, and they fled the South to come into the North where their family began. In the 1860s and 70s in the North, the family featured Maggie Owens, one of the daughters of Sabella Owens and Buck Hollinger, who had 9 children. These children then become the legend of John Weidman's stories about the black urban ghetto and about the black culture, the black civilization in America. If you notice, in the 1880s, those who are born and those who become the family are Ada and Bill Campbell. They're famous because Bill hit big on the numbers and they bought their house on the numbers racket. May and Bess. Now, Bess was born in the 80s along with her husband Riley Simpkins. And it's Bess who is the old aunt in The Hiding Place, whom we're going to read in this novel, married to Riley Simpkins, who has died years before she herself, and they had one son, Eugene, who, born around 1920, was old enough to go into the service and was killed several days after VJ Day in the Pacific. And that's their son, Eugene. And in this particular book, Tommy runs up to Bruston Hill, where he's going to be with Bess. The family, throughout John Weidman's novels, celebrates John French, who is the patriarch and the great-grandfather of John Weidman's own family, because one of the characteristics of these works is that Weidman interweaves his family into a narrative of power beyond belief, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. The children of Frida and John French, and John French is the hero of one of the books sent for you yesterday. And then the children of Frida Hollinger, John French, Elizabeth, who May saved when she was dying at childbirth, and May rushed out with her into the snow and smothered her body in the snow and cooled her down of her fever. And Edgar Lawson, who is the father of people in this novel. Tommy, married to Sarah, who have a son, Clyde. Judy and John, who have 3 children, Jake, Danny, and after this book was written, Jamila came along. Then another brother and sister, Shirley and Rashid, and it's Shirley who brings her daughter Kalisha to old Bess, to Aunt Bess, in order to have her cured of the illness. So what you have in this particular family tree is an outline of John Weidman's art. John Weidman is the celebrant of the Owens family and the celebrant of 7 generations of blacks in the North. He integrates himself into these novels. He's part of the novels, but he's able to distance himself from the novels. And it's a remarkable thing, these novels. We'll talk about them in a few moments, because John Weidman gives us Homewood. Homewood is an area in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which formerly was white, and then, as happens in many neighborhoods, transformed itself into a black neighborhood. Weidman himself, I'll give you a few details of his life so we know what he is about. The Owens family moved into the North in the 1880s. Pittsburgh was growing as a large black community, and particularly when the Depression hit in the 1930s, large numbers of black families moved from the South into the Iron City, the Steel City, where there were jobs. By 1930, there were 600, by the United Census count, there were 660,000 blacks living in the Pittsburgh area. The United States government census of 1940 tells us that 20% of the black families were run by women, but the majority of families in northern and western regions were at the time headed by married couples. By 1940, in the wars, women in the work population increased from less than 14 million to 20 million. By 1968, however, we find in the Kerner report that ghetto residents are living in appalling conditions. Crime rates are up to 35%, and unemployment, and we realize that Tommy himself is caught in a situation of unemployment. Tommy has no job, can support no family, can show no responsibility for his child. By the unemployment rate in the ghetto in 1968 was 30%, and the ratio of black income to white income since 1978 had dropped to 56%. What we're going to see when we look at Homewood is a changing community, and a community that has changed considerably from the time that John Weidman was a teenager to the time that his brother Tommy, who is the feature figure in this novel, came up and started running around with his gangs, or as Sarah characterizes them, his buddies, his buddy Rochelle, and the whores on the street, whom he preferred to Sarah. John Weidman is a unique person. Born in Washington, D.C. in June 14, 1941. You still have time to send him birthday cards in a month and a half. He grew up in Homewood. And he grew up at a time when, he says, there were rows and rows of homes. And these homes in Homewood had whole families. He said when he used to do something bad at one end of the street, his mother already knew it at the other end of the street. But he said by the time his brother Tommy grew up, Homewood had changed, and you did not any longer have these families living along the streets. The Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh has supplied me with some photographs of Homewood, And I'll show you one of those rows of houses that possibly characterized John Weidman's home in Homewood. This could be Kelly Street, or it could be any of the streets named in the hiding place itself. As you're moving up Ruston Hill, you go into a residence that is somewhat like this, but this is Homewood. And if you remember, from the top of Ruston Hill, you could look down on the entire city of Pittsburgh because it's in the Allegheny Mountains, and you get some idea of the kinds of homes that Bess may have been living in, the kinds of homes that John Weidman may have been living in when he was living in Homewood. Now, the Carnegie Library has given me the courtesy of this, so I'll put this on screen. So we have photos courtesy of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm grateful to H. David Rothman, a brother living there who was able to organize and supply these to us, and we'll have them to look at during this discussion. Let's look again at the chart. Weidman himself grew up in Homewood, but by 1959, when he was 18, he was already probably in 1955, he was in Peabody High School. Peabody High School is in the East Liberty section of Pittsburgh. It's not too far from Homewood, but Weidman's family by that time had moved to Shadyside, and he attended Peabody High School, where he was the class valedictorian and also its leading basketball player. John Weidman went to a school, a fairly well-balanced school. At the time he was in it, there may have been perhaps a 25% black population and a 75% white population, with a number of students living near and around Homewood from Italian families. He won a scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania, not only a brilliant student, but a brilliant basketball player, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a few moments. And from 1959 to 1963, he was captain of the University of Pennsylvania basketball team. In 1963, they had an undefeated season, and he was inducted into the Big Five Conference Hall of Fame. From 1963 to 66, he was a Rhodes Scholar, the second black Rhodes Scholar ever to carry out a full term in Oxford in more than 50 years. From 1907 to 1963, only 2 blacks had gone to Oxford, and John Weidman was one of them. In 1965, he married Judith Ann Goldman and had 3 children, Jake, Danny, and Jamila, to whom he has dedicated his books and about whom he is now writing. From 1966 to 1974, he became the first tenured black professor in the history of the University of Pennsylvania. In 1975, he went to the University of Wyoming to teach, and currently is at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. In 1984, he won the Penn Faulkner Award, and in 1992, he won the MacArthur Award, which is a 5-year cash award that allows him to do whatever he wants. When I spoke with him in Amherst 2 years ago, he said he still was going to teach a number of students who were his private writing students in their graduate program, but he wasn't sure how much other teaching he was going to do. But we know he's going to do a lot of writing. Now, let me talk a little bit about John Weidman's writing and tell you what he has done. In addition to novels and short stories, Weidman has contributed critical articles and essays and reviews to a number of sources. And I'm going to talk about these various books, but at the moment we'll just focus off the off the counter. Critical reviews have likened John Weidman to Faulkner, to James Joyce, and to Tolstoy. He himself has spoken of his indebtedness to Lawrence Sterne, who wrote Tristram Shandy, and others. His 1989 collection of short stories, entitled Fever, is a study in suffering. And Weidman, in some respects, likens his agony to the pain felt by the Lamed Vav of the Talmud, of Talmudic legend, those 30 just men who bear suffering in successive generations. And we'll talk about it in a few moments. One of the interesting characteristics of John Weidman is that his novels are of a real place and of real people. Unlike Faulkner, who brilliantly gives us Yoknepadapa County, which is a fictional county, although he draws from real experience, Weidman's characters are his family and himself. And it's a rather remarkable set of stories that we're going to look at. Not only does he give us a consummate pictorialization of black culture, but to his ambitious novelistic structures and to his ear for language, he gives us brilliant characterization and unique description. The autobiographical nature of his writing lends a final dimension to his works. And he creates characters dispassionately. He's able to stand aside from them even though they're his immediate relatives and friends. And we find people like Clemens in Hiding Place, though familiar, still fictionalized. We must understand in Weidman's works the nature of biographical origins in a way that Oliver Goldsmith gives us characters in the deserted village whom he himself knew. As with James Joyce, scenes are set in real places, and as with Joyce and Faulkner, there are profound family and psychological tensions told by exterior and interior monologues. One is always affected by outside stimuli, but always we get into the psychology and the psyche of these characters. And the four writers I've chosen to treat in the 20th century in this course, Kafka, Stein, McMurtry, and Weidman, all bring a unique voice. All let us into the voices of the characters, and we understand how their characters speak and the way they think, because we get inside of them. Weidman provides his first set of characters and our understanding of these characters, in a set of short stories called Damballa. We have a picture of Damballa. A number of the stories that first appeared in Damballa, Tommy, for example, tells us about the theft and the scam and the murder. And another story which John Weidman's brother was involved with, and for which he now is in jail for life. And another story, Solitary, describes he himself and his mother going to visit this son at Western Penitentiary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So in this early collection of short stories, Damballa, we already have the outline and the background of stories that are going to appear in the novel. We meet in one of the stories in Damballa, Daddy Garbage, a story in which two old black men, including Strayhorn, you remember, is the ice ball seller in the story, who beat up three people, who single-handedly beat up three people who tried to rob him. We have a story of two old men who find a baby in a garbage can and want to dignify the child by giving it a burial in the snow. We have a story in Damballa called The Love Song of Reba Love Jackson, a gospel singer who goes north to sing the blues. Her family thinks she's been corrupted. But the voices of Reba Love Jackson and John Weidman's capability to bring gospel music into his novels also is found in The Hiding Place, and you'll read about that. Weidman has 3 books that are incorporated into stories about Homewood. One is Damballa, the other is The Hiding Place, and the third is Sent for You Yesterday. If you'll look at this chart again. Damballa, Hiding Place, and Sent for You Yesterday are the 3 books that fit into what we call, or what Weidman calls, the Homewood Trilogy. It is the depth perception of this description of the black ghetto in Pittsburgh's Homewood that likens The Hiding Place and Sent for You Yesterday to the account of Yokneparva County in The Sound and the Fury and Absalom and Absalom. If Faulkner's great-grandfather proved himself a fighter and a carouser, perhaps the model for Thomas Sutpen, establishing his mark on the land, Weidman's paternal grandfather, John French, is no less a black hero, carousing with John Wilkes, proving his manhood and his mettle. And Weidman gives us this description of his grandfather, John French, one of the grandfathers whose burial we read about in The Hiding Place. John French was a paper hanger. He took all kinds of old jobs. The first man this morning on the corner of Frankstown and Homewood, where the white men drive up in their trucks with a little piece of work you might get if you're lucky, if you're early, and smile, and act like Jesus himself behind the wheel of them pickups. John French yawns, his wallpapering tools in a sack beside his knees, a canvas drawstring sack it takes a good man to heft. He has these pictures of this powerful person. In Sent for You Yesterday, Weidman gives us the picture of Samantha. Samantha is a woman, a black woman who desires to issue the blackest babies from her ark, her womb. It is the hallmark of the novel, for it brings together the biblical, the historical, the scientific. John French, looking at his daughter, standing in his brogans and his shoes, says, in Sent for You Yesterday, the prize-winning novel by John Weidman, the seed gets planted. So, of course, you're going to watch it and watch it grow. Weidman's novels celebrate the strength of the black family, whether it is unified or divisive, joyful or saddened, unified or dysfunctional. His world is the ghetto with its back-to-back homes, its red wine bars like the Velvet Slipper where Carl, brother, and Lucy drink, the Bucket of Blood, John French's favorite bar, its barber shops, bordered storefronts, pawn shops, and streetcar tracks leading in and out to the white world, and the occasional triumph, a house purchased with the winnings of a numbers hit. Weidman records the innermost thoughts of the people reconciling themselves to their background, their family, their environs, some passive, some protesting, some failing of their dreams, some finding solace in liquor and drugs, some in the daily strife, some failing like Tommy, and some succeeding like John. Weidman is no apologist for the appetites of the ghetto. He is an artist in his ability to understand man's needs for satisfaction in food, sex, music, and words. Weidman's words are the gift of the bard. He's a poet in prose. Robert Burns, in his youth, sat to hear an old maid tell endless tales of warlocks and kelpies. Weidman, in the guise of Dute, tells us that he would sit for hours at the foot of May and listen to her tell stories of his family and Sibel Owens and John French and the powers of the family that gave it structure and that gave it order and that gave it control and that gave it eloquence. Each of Weidman's novels is characterized by a different voice. Let me just mention a few of these novels, and when we get into Hiding Home, The Hiding Place, we will get some idea of where he is coming from. A Glance Away. I don't even have it here. It's one of his earliest novels. A Glance Away. Describes Eddie Lawson's return home on Easter Day. Eddie, returning from a year's effort to kick his drug habit, seeks to live up to the ideal reputation of his older brother Eugene, who died in the war. Now, in the novel, Bess and Riley's son Eugene has no other relative. Remember, Bess says she squeezed out one alone, and Abraham and Sarah match, an older man and a middle and older woman, and all she had was enough strength to squeeze out one, and the war took him. And later on she says, "Don't nobody call me mama. I ain't nobody's mama. I was a mama once, but I ain't nobody's mama now." The experiences of Robert Thurley, a white literature professor, is told in this novel as they sit with Brother Small and Eddie and others around a fire, around the campfire near the railroad tracks, isolated and disoriented. Hurry Home, another one of his early novels, gives us Cecil Otis Braithwaite's stream of consciousness narratives. Cecil Otis Braithwaite. Braithwaite is a janitor attending school. He abandons his wife on their wedding night, but returns 3 years later to take up his life as a hairdresser after living in Europe and dreaming of Africa. The death of their child before their marriage is part of the trauma. The Lynchers in 1973. Let's look at that for a moment. The Lynchers in 1973, before the Homewood Trilogy, describes 4 black men who planned to kill a prostitute sissy and a policeman, her pimp, to inspire anarchy in the city. They are the teacher, Thomas Wilkerman, a dwarf, Willie Littleman Hall, a writer, Graham Rice, who for all practical purposes is John Weidman himself, and Leonard Saunders, whose mother died when he was 15. She was a woman, Leonard tells us, a prostitute, a pitiable black woman done to death by cruel, lusting men who forced children upon her and fled back to the darkness from which they crawled. But she was also, later in life, a respectable church-going lady, saved, proud of the children she had launched into the seas of life. This ambivalence, no matter what happens, the children maintain their virtue. Children maintain their support. The plan to stimulate anarchy in the city fails because Littleman is knocked unconscious by the police and hospitalized while instigating a protest on the steps of Woodrow Wilson Jr. High School. Tom Wilkinson's involvement ends when his father, R.N. Sweetman Wilkinson, shoots and kills his best friend, Childress, in a brawl. We read about these fights all the time. They argued over who would pay for a gallon of gasoline. And Sweetman shoots and kills his best friend. And his son, who's involved in this plot, then has to find a way to get his father out of jail and then to find some support for his father's best friend's widow, who has no food for her children. The novel suggests that everything dies in the ghetto, which doesn't nurture creation, which doesn't nurture creativity. The novel narrates the stifled anger of the black man and concludes with a sense of rage unsatisfied, yet incapable of being resolved. The Hiding Place is a particularly unique novel because there are events that precede it, stories that precede it, the novel itself, and unique circumstances that have followed it. Weidman told interviewers that he conceived Hiding Place in his mind in a flash, from beginning to end. He knew how it was going to begin, he knew how it was going to end, and the sequences were arbitrary, and they could be arranged in various ways to suit the narrative. And we're going to look at this narrative in a few moments. But he said the ending was clear. Now, this recitation is only partially correct. In 1976, John Weidman's brother, Robbie Weidman, and his buddies arranged a scam whereby they were going to sell a truckload of TV sets to a fence and gain a profit from it. The problem was that they had no TV sets. So they were going to rob the fence, and in the novel his name is Indavina, and they were going to take his money and then worry later about how he could complain to the police or what his recourse might be. How can you go to the police when you're trying to steal stolen goods or sell stolen goods? In this shooting, in this arrangement, a man was killed. And in the state of Pennsylvania, as I understand it, even if you did not pull the trigger, but if you are involved in the commission of a crime and a death occurs, you are equally culpable for the crime. So, Robbie Weidman was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole in Western Penitentiary Prison in the Pittsburgh area. And this book, Hiding Place, comes out of that experience. Because Robbie Weidman, when he was involved in this crime, fled to Wyoming to his brother John Weidman. John was was concerned at one point whether he would be convicted of harboring a fugitive from justice. When Robbie was finally committed to prison for life, Weidman was able to write his story Solitary, which appears in that collection, Damballa, where he describes his mother and himself in the humiliating experience of being frisked by the guards, being held suspect by the guards, and being admitted to see their brother in this situation. From that experience has emerged another book that John Weidman wrote in 1984 called Brothers and Keepers. Brothers and Keepers was a book that was treated in 60 minutes in one production, and it describes John Weidman's voice and Robbie's voice. Weidman said he wrote the book twice. He wasn't satisfied. He was speaking about Robbie and having Robbie speak through his voice. But he changed it so he got Robbie's voice the way he wanted people to hear it, the way Robbie himself spoke it. And so Brothers and Keepers becomes a rather sensational book dealing with two brothers. One in jail for the rest of his life, the other a Rhodes Scholar, an Oxford Scholar, one of the most brilliant writers in America today, bar none. There are not very many writers in America today writing at the level of poetic quality that John Weidman provides. That is, when you're teaching Weidman, you're teaching Joyce and you're teaching Faulkner. This is the level that we're at. Now, Weidman told interviewers that he conceived the hiding place in his mind in a flash from beginning to end. The sequences were arbitrary. He said they could be arranged. This book deals with his return after being out west. Remember, there's some ambiguity. John actually comes to the bar inquiring about his brother, and people in the bar know that he's from somewhere out west. He's from Colorado. John has to remind them he's from Wyoming. And they say it must be nice to be in a place where there's no crime. You have all that empty space, all that forest land. John's voice is more subdued, more characteristic of an educated person than Tommy's in the novel. And we get those sequences where John keeps slipping in and out of hiding place. The story, of course, as we know it, has Tommy hiding in Bess's shed on Bruston Hill. Drawn after Weidman's own great-great-aunt, Bess is depicted as having isolated herself from the family on Bruston Hill after the death of her husband. She continues to mourn the loss of her son killed in World War II. The combination of dialogue and monologue in this novel pits this young buck, this young black man, this 25-year-old fugitive, against Mother Time, seeking to inure herself against pain. Chapters entitled with the names of the characters weave the stories intertextually of Tommy's desperate thoughts and his divergence and reconciliation with Bess. Tommy is rejected by his wife, but at the end he's persuaded to return to his family. He still has a son who has to know his daddy. He still has a wife whom he loves, though she has withdrawn from him. And the novel also brings out Bess. Bess has rejected the family. She has moved. She no longer is a husband. She no longer is a child. She no longer is religious, she says. And she's there by herself without anyone to bother her. She has no electricity. Why don't you have electricity, Tommy says. She says, at night it's time to go to bed. And while she recognizes that this boy has done something wrong, he is still her blood. He's still the progeny of Elizabeth, whom May saved in the snow. And the stories keep coming back and back of how this family must generate itself and must sustain itself. So that at the end of the novel, all the people who tried to persuade Bess to come down, all the people who wanted to take care of her, couldn't do what Tommy does, or Robbie in this case, and bring Bess down. I want to spend a little bit of time, just a few moments, on the novel Sent for You Yesterday, only because it's a unique novel. In some ways, it could be taught in parallel with Leaving Cheyenne. This story has Carl French, Frida and John French's son, a friend, the albino brother, who becomes part of the Tate family, and Lucy Tate. And Carl and brother and Lucy grow up together. They suffer the same addictions. They try to withdraw. But all their lives they're together as close friends until brother dies, and then a normal sequence of events. Events in this novel proceed from the year 1920, when Brother Tate is born, through 1970, when Doot, that's John Weidman, now a married man, hungrily devours the stories of the heritage of Homewood and the diseases of Black America. I want to read to you one statement from the end of Sent for You Yesterday. Sent for You Yesterday won the Faulkner Award, a major award for John Weidman. And it's a powerful novel in the stream of consciousness technique that I hope you have a chance to follow and read even after this course is over. Carl is describing his life as a junkie. Now listen to the poetry, listen to the psychology, listen to the voice that John Weidman gives. And as soon as we finish with this, we'll move on to our discussion of the hiding place. I shouldn't say the hiding place, of hiding place. Who hides and where. Carl describes his life as a junkie. And he says, I ain't gonna lie now. I ain't gonna lie now like I'm supposed to and say how it tore me up to be a junkie. Nope. 'Cause it was better being than being nothing. World was a hurtin' trick, and being high was being out of the world. Nothing wrong with that. If you find a way out the trick bag, you're a fool not to take it. You take it and it makes you feel good, and that's that. Why the hell not? I mean, it's your body, it's your life. Shit, whoever said you're supposed to just stand still and suffer? No. You take the freedom train running through your veins. You get on board and couldn't care less where it's headed. don't care nothing about dues, about the conductor coming one day to kick your ass off. All that's farther down the line. And down the line don't matter. It's the minutes that matter, the hour or the day, if you can keep feeling good that long. What you have is the deep psychology. He's not being apologetic. He's not complaining about the lot of these people. These people are the way they are for whatever reason they are, and they're part of the culture of Homewood and of his family. Weidman keeps changing. Some of his recent books, Reuben, are fascinating. His new collection of short stories, Fever, takes them into different paths. He deals in Fever with Valeda, where he pictures the relationship between a cleaning woman and an old white Jew, the survivor of a concentration camp. In Little Brother, black family members express sentiments about a pet dog that has died and a new dog who has not yet gained acceptance. There are many, many stories in Fever that suggest that Weidman is moving in a different direction, broadening his purview, but his spirit, his heart, his craft lies in Homewood. And I want to now focus our attention, for the most part, upon Homewood. Remember, this is a remarkable writer. He's in no way differentiated other than his ability as a writer, as an athlete, as a scholar. I understand he was Penn's leading scorer with 330 points in his junior year and 346 as a senior. This is probably very good in the Ivy League. Houston with Hakeem Olajuwon may have better figures, although I haven't compared them. But anyone who can captain his team, score that many points, end up in Oxford, and find himself a major writer of America deserves our attention. And now we're going to focus on the novel and the parts of the novel. Now, the novel is rather interesting because John Weidman gives us, I like that long shot, good to see everybody here. The first part of the novel and the second part we should analyze in terms of what the structures really are. Each of the characters, Clement, Bess, and Tommy, has 6 parts. In the first part, Clement has 4. His is the first part, the third part, the 7th part, and the 9th part in the first half. Bess has 3 parts in the first half, and Tommy has 4. So we hear the voice of each of these figures, and it becomes contrapuntal. Like a symphony, Weidman begins to give us one voice and then another, and we come back to the first voice, and then he brings in the third voice, and the voices begin to reflect upon each other through the novel. One of the things you might do in your own book is mark off your chapters. John Weidman doesn't do it, but I would call Weidman's first chapter Clement number 1, Bess 2, Clement 3, Tommy 4. You can do this because I'm going to refer to these sometimes, and we may benefit from this. Tommy is 6, 7. Tommy is 8. Clement, the half page. Clement item is 9. Bess is 10, and Tommy is 11. Let's do that one more time so you have it. Clement will be 1. Bess is 2. The third Clement is 3. Tommy is 4. Bess, 11 pages, is 5. Tommy is 6. Clement is 7. Tommy is 8. Clement is 9. Bess is 10. And Tommy is 11. Pardon me? Right. Now, go to part 2. I go to part 2. Part 2 has 2 sections with Clement, 3 with Bess. So Bess begins, part 2 is 12. And we'll try to understand how these structures work. If you look at part 2, which begins on page 91, Bess would be chapter 12, Clement would be 13, Tommy is 14, Bess is 15, Clement is 16, Tommy is 17, and Bess ends at 18. So that the Clement sections will be 1, 3, 7, 9, 13, and 16. The Bess sections will be 2, 5, 10, 12, 15, and 18. And the Tommy sections will be 4, 6, 8, 11, 14, and 17. If you divide the chapters up like that, we can somewhat refer to them. It's very, very difficult to do what John Weidman has done, to take these chapters and synthesize them. But his is the synthesis, mine is going to be the analysis. And therefore, when I start discussing these chapters, I'm going to do Clement first, all the Clement chapters. Then I'm going to do all the Bess chapters, and then all the Tommy chapters. This, to some extent, defeats what Weidman himself has tried to do by integrating these chapters. But the role of the critic is analysis, the role of the writer is synthesis, and we'll work at that. The first thing we're going to look at is the Clement chapter, and we find Clement in the barbershop. I don't have a Homewood barbershop here, but Steve Glickman of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who has a hobby of shooting pictures of barbers all over the world, has given me a few barbershops, and we'll look at them we'll look at some barber scenes in just a second. As soon as I find them here for you. Give me one moment. This is a black barber shop in 1982. It's actually not in Homewood, it's in Florida. I have to be honest with you. Can't portray. You may be looking at someone like Big Bob. Notice the old sterilizer in the back. The fluorescent lights. This is a 1982 photograph, but the barbershop still is somewhat old. There's your typical barber sink. Shampoos. Actually, I think that the barbershops are not allowed to use brushes anymore because they're not sterile. So here is a modern barbershop still using your sterile brushes and your hoses. And then in the ghetto, you do have a unique barber pole. Nothing but a post painted black and red. No revolving lights. No spiraling plastic shields. And the storefront itself is probably the same type of storefront you would find in the 3rd Ward in Houston. This becomes, these are photographs from the Pittsburgh photographer. We'll leave on the barber as we talk about, if we want to see it every once in a while. Clement begins the story, The Hiding Place, and Clement becomes a major figure in it. Because through Clement's eyes, we get the story of Big Bob, the story of Miss Claudine, the altercation and the tempestuous love affair between Claudine and Big Bob. We realize that, among other things that the barbershop provides, is a numbers racket, is an outlet for the numbers business. Today in Houston, I guess, and in many states in this nation, the lottery is no longer a clandestine activity, the poor man's gambling hall, but barbershops throughout the East and throughout the North traditionally were the spots for selling numbers and for paying out those who hit the numbers. You'd walk past numbers spots and know that there was an illegal operation going on. It seems somewhat odd today to realize that you're walking past every gas station and every 7-Eleven and enjoying the benefits, if you win the lottery or playing the lottery, of what just a year ago or 2 years ago was absolutely illegal. And I wonder today whether the lottery has put the numbers racket out of business. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But that's for the sociologists, not for the English professors to worry about. We get the voice of Clement. Now before we go on, I want to focus on voices, because we're going to study the voices of Clement. We're going to study the voices of Big Bob. We're going to hear the voice of Tommy. We're going to listen to the voice of Aunt Bess. And I want to look at some of these voices and see how they sound to us, because John Weidman is interested in how people hear his voices, and they're very important to him. So let us take a few moments as we go into the plot to hear Clement's voice, and then to hear the voices of others whom we're going to listen to tonight. give me one moment to bring together these notes on the voices, and we'll listen to them. That's what I'm looking for. Thank you very much. It's good to have perceptive people in the class. First, we're going to look at the voice of Clement. Clement wishes he was the empty cup. Somebody needs to open the top of his head and pour out all the nasty stuff up there. It would be so thick and greasy in a sink bowl. It would be so thick and greasy in a sink bowl, you'd have to wash it away with a blast from the spigot. So we get the idea in this first chapter that he's slow, but not because he is suffering from birth defects or not because he has a low IQ. We get to see Clement from Clement's viewpoint. There's something in his head. There's something that keeps him stuffed up. There's something that keeps him from thinking clearly. And John Weidman gives us Clement's voice, not some doctor or not some medical scholar approaching him from that standpoint. Clement listens to the conversation in the barber shop. And let's look at this conversation. Clement listened to them talk. And they're talking about the killings that go on in the bars at night. With the Saturday night specials and the knivings and the killings between friends, such as we saw in the novel The Lynchers. Clement listened to them talk. 2 men dead, niggers caught and niggers running away. He snorted some of that nasty stuff down in his head. Tasted like blood in his raw throat. But he swallowed because ain't no place to spit. Full this morning. Head felt like a bucket of soggy grits. Couldn't keep his eyes dry for blinking, and snot rag balled in his back pocket had been folded and refolded so many times he didn't want to touch it anymore. The voice is what Weidman is looking for. When we looked at Kafka, when we looked at Gertrude Stein, when we looked at Larry McMurtry, we were trying to find the voice. When Clement goes to Claudine to get Big Bob's coffee at the restaurant, let's look at that. Clement watches her. Now you see, what you're doing is coming at Clement through the eyes of you're coming to Clement through his eyes as John Weidman plants it with his poetry. Clement watches her fit the lid on the styrofoam cup. Her purple finger circles 3 times, twice softly pressing on the lid, and once more spiraling in the air just above the sealed lips of the cup. Just above the sealed lips of the cup. He won't repeat to Big Bob anything Miss Claudine has said. He doesn't need to, because Big Bob hears every word. Now, what are the words that Big Bob hears? She still loves me, don't she, boy? She's still talking trash, ain't she? That old buddy would cut my heart out if she could. Go back to the screen. Cut it out and put it on a platter and just sit there and die happy looking at my heart on her platter on her table in the kitchen. We go back a long way, 30 years if it's a day, and she ain't never forgives or forgot Big Bob. But you don't know what I'm talking about, do you, boy? Just words to you, ain't it, boy? Love, just a word to you. Now what you have are two voices. The voice of Clement watching Claudine, thinking about Claudine. And then Clement keeping to himself politically Claudine's words to him about Big Bob, and Big Bob's words about Claudine that he could tell her, but he doesn't. They're all in his mind. But the voices play out uniquely because this is Weidman's forte, his ability to tell us voices. Let's move on into the Clement chapters. More voices about Clement. Someone wants to give Clement a tip. He's won the numbers. But he shows everyone in the store that he's giving Clement a $10 bill, but slips a $1 bill into Clement's pocket. So he's talking big, but acting small. But the bill rolled and slipped in his fists was a 10. And the bill rammed down in his pockets was a 1. And the man was scooting him out the door and winking because he knew Clement could count. And he didn't want anyone to know that he was pulling this sham off. Lying, and the men always be lying. Lying early in the morning, lying till Big Bob shoos them out the door and it rings the last time. Except once more when Big Bob locks it and slams it behind him. And Clement is alone and lies still crawling across the floor, sticking in his broom, hiding under the dirt. Clement now, when the doors close, has to clean it. And then at night, he sleeps in the back room. Where does he sleep? Let's put this out again. He finds hairballs, so he can still hear those lies as he sweeps the floor, as all these men are lying, scamming each other, playing the dozens. He hears them plain as he hears the door saying goodbye when it says hello, as he hears it saying Big Bob is gone again and it's night, and then saying Big Bob is here again and it's morning. Now what you have there is the stream of consciousness. What is in Clement's head? And night and day means little to him. It's night when the door closes and he cleans up. It's day when the door opens and morning comes. And again, John Weidman is giving us these figures. Then later, when Clement figures it out, that it is Tommy who's at Ruston Hill. Because as you realize from the novel, Clement is a delivery boy for Aunt Bess. He brings her groceries. He also plays the numbers for her. And remember how mad Big Bob is when she hits big, and he's just upset that he has to give Clement all this money in big bags she supplies. She knew she was going to win. She's absolutely confident, and Big Bob can't take it. And Clement now is talking about Tommy. And there's some indication that Tommy is unhappy that he's taking up food. Clement is unhappy he's taking up food and having to serve two masters at Ruston Hill. One of the indicators that he may be the one who told the police where she could be found. Remember at the end of one chapter it says, there are two, he would like them to be one again. There's that hidden secret of Clement's. The man she called a body, the man Clement could see through, but who wasn't no ghost. That Tommy Lawson they all talking about, and Big Bob's, and Miss Claudine, and the brass rail. He the one, Carl and that stranger talking about, and he ain't caught yet, him nor his partner Rochelle. Tommy Lawson's the one, still loose, but he ain't 1,000 miles away. just on Bruston Hill in her house. How do we change, and how does John Weidman change from the voice we're listening to, which is the voice of Clement, to the voice of Tommy Lawson and the voice of Aunt Bess? Well, I'm going to look at some of these voices, the way they reflect. It's not easy to show you exactly what kind of house Bess lived on. Of course, look at the scenes here. This is Kelly Street, or the street that John Weidman himself might have lived on. I don't know, I don't have the exact street names, but if this were Tioga Street, Tioga Way would be one of the alleyways behind the house where the car is parked there. This, of course, is the 1960s when Tommy was growing up in Homewood. It's very likely that Bess's house may have looked like this. This is a picture from the Carnegie Library of a child standing at a ramshackle house with a little doorstep behind it, wooden frame. The youngster is white. This picture was probably shot in the 20s at the time. And what might a Bess herself have looked like? Here are some of the women in Homewood sitting at the fence, probably gossiping over the fence. You can see some of the ramshackle homes behind. This could be Bruston Hill with the broken out fence. People sitting on a barrel, the women talking to each other. Well, when we come back after the break, we're going to hear more voices. We're going to hear the voices of Tommy speaking with Aunt Bess. And we're going to hear this altercation, because there you get Bess's voice in various characteristic ways, and you get Tommy both bitterly and reminiscent of his family. Bitter in his recognition, his discussions with Bess, and somewhat remorseful when he thinks about what he has lost and the times he no longer can spend with his son, Clyde. So let's take the break, and we'll come back and talk more about Hiding Place. Thank you.